The Woman Who Fell to Earth is one I always remember liking, but having barely seen it more than once since it aired, I genuinely forgot how much I enjoy it. Particularly the characterizations and Jodie Whittaker's performance really do it for me. The approach is very low-key and grounded compared to any of the Davies or Moffat premieres, but Doctor No. 13 is still a great big ball of energy. Whittaker captures the character instantly and has a very unique charm, which in the right moments really makes Chris Chibnall's material sing. Ryan, Graham, and Yaz all actually get really great character introductions. Especially in hindsight, I can tell a lot about who these people are and what they want within moments of meeting them. I think the cast has a fun chemistry, or at least the foundations for one. It's got a surprising amount of big laughs, the tragedy in the third act works. Putting aside that Tim Shaw's a kinda weak villain, I really like this story. Check out my channel for more videos reviewing the show up to this point, and subscribe for more like this. The Ghost Monument is surprisingly slow for an episode that's all about the final leg of a space race. Given the premise of our new TARDIS team falling into a competition between heated rivals on a planet of death and despair, you'd expect a lot more action and tension, and a lot less walking and talking. There is some action here, but this setup is begging to be a roller coaster and it just isn't done justice. Beyond that, it's a much more awkward, much less compelling and endearing sit than the previous story. There's some good, sweet, smaller character moments and some scenes that work broadly on paper, but are held back by some stupid choices. Jodie is still on top form, and it's mostly her carrying the whole thing. As a whole, though, it's really just kind of a slog, with the easy highlights being the reveal of the new intro and new TARDIS interior, both of which I really like. Rosa is a truly unique animal. I like how unsafe this episode feels for our team. Something standard or formula, like a moment of exposition or planning the next course of action, is always in danger at the hands of plain old mundane human cruelty around every corner. Call it forced or heavy-handed, but I like having a story where our characters can speak so frankly to how a real-world political issue impacts their everyday lives. The story is all about the impact of little things, both in the sense that it's literally a butterfly effect plot, and in how it's the small human moments that make the whole thing work. Bits like Ryan and Yaz commiserating over the racism they face, or Ryan helping a wary and guarded Rosa, feel a moment of appreciation and hope. Heck, the fact that the emotional climax is just the tragedy of the Doctor and Graham having to own their privilege, the viewer having to face that what our heroes have done here is orchestrate an act of bigotry. It's all really effective and not something you're gonna get from another story. Arachnids in the UK is the unfortunate type of episode that's exactly middle of the road. Enough good and bad in it to almost completely cancel each other out. On the one hand, it's got some solid laughs and some sweet character moments. On the other hand, it exemplifies Chibnall's capacity for very weak, very simplistic dialogue writing. It has an extremely muddled and ineffective moral debate in the third act, and while I get that it's just putting the viewer in Graham's headspace, the whole having him actually see Grace like she's a literal ghost thing is a storytelling device that I just don't vibe with. That's especially true when the episodes before and after this one handle Grace much better as a figurative specter. At the very least, the episode ends with what's easily its strongest scene, so I finish it with a smile on my face. But I'm not one of those the ending matters above all else type guys, and as a whole package, this one is okay at best. The Tsuranga Conundrum is a story that I like a lot as a collection of small moments and ideas, but I'm kinda iffy on as a complete package. I like the sense of world building, the feeling that the one-off characters and setting here have lives, or functions, or backstories outside the confines of this 45 minutes. I like that feeling Chibnall is so good at portraying, where problems just pile on and escalate as the episode goes. And I really like the Pating as a threat and as a design. For this show, it's also a really good effect. On paper, everything about this one works, minus one or two dodgy acting moments and some dialogue that feels a bit shoehorned in. The big thing it's missing is a sense of urgency. Even as the conflicts and ticking clocks pile up, there's just something in the production that doesn't communicate the tension the way it does in something like 42. The score, the direction, the editing, the blocking, none of it is bad, but it doesn't do anything to elevate what's on the page, doesn't do anything to make this exciting. It's why I always defend this one, but seldom rewatch it. It's a story that I've already spoken about at length in a pre-existing video time again. Demons of the Punjab not only sheds light on an underrepresented historical tragedy in a relevant, meaningful way, it also uses it as a base for a great emotional time travel story about love, death, bigotry, and love reborn. In the best way possible, it feels like our leads are forced to observe a period drama about a family tragically breaking alongside a country. Team TARDIS all give great performances, even Tosin Cole, despite his lack of material to work with being Demon's one glaring flaw. The most impressive bits of acting come from the one-offs though. Shane Zaza is iffy in some spots, but in others he cuts right to the bone with just an expression. Hamza Tatua is the story's MVP, brimming with both vulnerability and contempt. And you know, I'm gonna do something I never do, which is shout out the VA performances for the fully costumed alien characters. Emma Fielding and Isabel Middleton give the Thajarians so much reverent emotion, it really grounds the sci-fi part of the story. I could go on, this one is a modern classic. Kerblam is great. I just needed to rip that band-aid off or else I'd spend the whole short hemming and hawing about how this story's themes and messages have been received by the more politically staunch members of the fanbase. The way it's been characterized all this time, you'd think it was some kind of pro-capitalist screed, which it really isn't. What it is a story with some flawed or overly simplistic but still very, very interesting things to say about the workforce, about radicalism, and about the nature and potential of automation both in and outside of it. Seriously, I could write a whole essay about the role of AI in this episode and how it fascinates me, especially with that being a more hot-button issue in the years since. But beyond that, Kerblam is just a really solid adventure. Team TARDIS feels like they finally hit a stride with their group chemistry, and all of them are utilized well, as are all the one-offs. I especially love Jodie, she's so cool. The mystery is well structured and thought out, it's exciting, it's the most the show has made me laugh in a while. It's got those sweet character moments again, sorry guys, but I love this one. The Witchfinders is unworthy of its incredibly entertaining Alan Cumming performance. Cumming and Whittaker, and also the Direction, are all trying their hardest to elevate this material, but it's blander than Wonder Bread. To begin with, I'm not really a fan of stuff that's just people walking and standing and talking in grey rooms or grey forests, and that's all of this episode. It's actually an interesting contrast to Kerblam, because while that was a cleverly constructed, engaging mystery, where all the companions were utilized well, Witchfinders is a story where one companion could have done the work of three, and where the mystery is just the Doctor standing in front of the villain and yelling, "What's going on?" for 20 minutes until an exposition dump happens. The side characters aren't engaging, the dialogue is boring, the actual plot of what's going on is super thin, and the resolution is perfunctory. I expect to forget this episode exists after posting this video, easily the weakest of the season so far. It Takes You Away is an easy highlight of the series, as good as Demons of the Punjab, if not slightly better. It takes some fascinating, esoteric sci-fi concepts and builds a very simple but emotionally powerful story around them. A story about the way isolation can drive us to do very dumb and hurtful things, and how what we all need to be better is people in our lives who will shoot straight, who won't sugarcoat harsh truths just to make us feel like things are the way we want. It's a theme that makes for a great character arc for Ryan, but also for one-off characters Hannah, Eric, and even the Soul Attract. It's subtle if you're not paying attention to it, but if you are, it's super effective. It's a pivotal moment for Ryan's growth and his relationship with Graham, which is impressive given they spend most of the story apart. That said, it's Jodie Whittaker who swoops in and steals the episode in its climax. She goes from largely a source of exposition and laughs to the astoundingly sincere beating heart of the narrative. Her performance carries what should be a ridiculous rushed moment into something truly powerful. If this one's not an all-time great, it's pretty freaking close. I've used first draft as shorthand for an especially poor story throughout these reviews, but the Battle of Ranskoor Av Kolos is the first one that I'm aware of for which that's literally true. It's got one thing in common with the last story, I guess, and that the thing that stuck out to me most is the Ryan character work. But while that was just one of a great many engaging and interesting elements in It Takes You Away, in Ranskoor it's the single saving grace that can't actually save anything. The scenes of half-decent character drama between Ryan and Graham are barely 1/3 of a story that is otherwise completely, utterly mired in exposition and plot and technobabble. All the areas where Chibnall's writing is the clunkiest. The Doctor, Yaz, Tim Shaw, and all the one-off characters are given nothing to work with, despite Jodie Whittaker and Samuel Oakley trying their hardest to elevate the material. It's a dull, gray slog that could barely hold my attention for a full scene. Broken down, I guess there's more to like here than in Witchfinders, but this is only one of 2 episodes in this show to literally put me to sleep, and it honestly makes me a bit angry. Resolution is, fittingly enough, the true resolution to Series 11. More than any other special, this feels like an actual finale, and not just because a Dalek story is basically a rite of passage for any TARDIS team. We bring Ryan's arc, really the big underlying story of the season, full circle. His dad Aaron and the conflict there is written with shocking subtlety and economy by Chibnall standards, and it paves the way for Tecteun and Daniel Adeboyega to give truly affecting performances. I'm also very impressed with Charlotte Ritchie as the Daleks' human hostage. For all we've seen them wreak havoc on a wide scale, there's something novel about spending so much of this story on a Dalek tormenting and puppeteering just one regular terrified woman as it slowly reconstructs itself and leaves behind a trail of bodies. As a Dalek story, it's utterly unique, but it's also the first time in a long while that I think one of these captures the Doctor-Dalek dynamic the way I like it most. Chibnall and Whittaker take the chance to bring out the Doctor's pointed, loathing, competitive side. It's really fun. This is the first Chibnall script that I feel truly fires on all cylinders. Top tier for modern Dalek stories. I always forget Series 11 is 3 or 4 episodes shorter than any prior run of stories. I consider it a step down from Series 10, but only a slight one. Right now, I'd say it's most akin to Series 1, 2, 6, or 8, which I guess fittingly are mostly also seasons introducing new Doctors. Separated from the noxious online discourse, Series 11 was overall a really fun rewatch, though dragged down by the occasional clunker. A couple of stories were a real snooze, but even in the worst stories, I tended to find positives to latch onto, namely the overarching character stuff. Yaz kinda gets the shaft, but I left these stories with a way deeper appreciation for Ryan, Graham, and Dr. 13 than I've ever had before. Witchfinders and Ranskoor are the only ones I'd call trash that I have no desire to ever watch again. But by contrast, Rosa and the series premiere were both quite strong, and if it takes you away, Punjab, Kerblam, and Resolution aren't outright classics, then they certainly come close. Ultimately, I'm happy with this revisit, and I feel this series deserves to be looked on more fondly. Spyfall is far from awful, but heavily flawed. This story solidifies a bit of a pattern I've noticed in Chibnall scripts as showrunner. Fun or neat character traits and beats communicated with some of the least natural dialogue the show's yet had. But I really like what that dialogue is in service of, mostly, when it's not just characters narrating what's happening to them like an audio drama. The first half is easily the weaker of the two, with Lenny Henry utterly wasted as the plank of wood villain Barton. But then Sacha Dhawan reveals himself as the Master, and from that scene on, the story has an energy that at least carries me through to the end. All throughout, Chibnall continues to prove solid at the comedy and the warm, sweet character relationship moments, but even with Part 2 picking up, the plot here feels unfocused. The story is torn between two big motifs, one being the history of computer technology and the other being spycraft. Those two broad ideas should naturally come together, but I don't know if they really complement each other by the end of this. It feels like Chibnall really wanted to explore both motifs in tandem, but hadn't worked out a clear theme that services both. Orphan 55 is that rare story that's genuinely a chore to finish. What it reminds me most of is honestly Nightmare in Silver. The script had to have been horribly compromised somewhere in the production, because there's no other way I could picture the guy who gave us It Takes You Away writing something so confusing, meandering, and boring in that way only a complete hack job can be. The plot technically has a lot going on, arguably too much, but at the same time it feels like nothing happened in it. There's some small cute character moments scattered about, but for the most part the TARDIS crew feels like an afterthought in this bloated cast, the Doctor included. It doesn't help that you could 100% cut half or more of the characters here while losing almost nothing, and even the ones who are vital to the plot leave no impression and are treated by the story as disposable. It all builds to the Orphan 55 was Earth all along twist, which is contrived and only serves to force a message about environmentalism. It's just an utterly flaccid story, and I had mentally checked out well before it finished. Why is Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror set almost entirely in daytime? I can't speak for what the real Nikola Tesla was like, but I find the character they've created with him here really endearing and interesting. Gotta say, I still like this one, but it didn't hit for me the way it has in the past. It's solid, and I like what it has to say about the nature of genius and invention versus those who profit off it, but something's just missing to tip it over into great territory. I think the problem is it's one of those episodes that gets a bit too hung up on plot and theme and loses out on character. Again, Tesla himself is great, and he bounces well off both the Doctor and Thomas Edison, but anyone who's not Goran Vishnik doesn't get a ton of material to work with. It's not a dearth of character, everyone at least feels human and multifaceted, and that helps the themes feel nuanced. It's frustrating, but I can't fully articulate what missing ingredient stops this one from going beyond a solid B grade, a worthwhile watch, but not the modern classic I once viewed it as. Did you know I talk about Marvel and Kingdom Hearts sometimes? Click the related video to listen to me talk at length about both and how I'd cross them over. Fugitive of the Judoon holds up way better than I figured it would. However you may feel about how the threads here are paid off, I think the events of this story are a really powerful launchpad for the 13th Doctor's long-lasting identity crisis. Knowing where it all goes makes the intended emotions land really well. Seeing Captain Jack again is great, and part of me really likes what his scenes with the other companions accomplish here, but another part of me thinks that if anything would make this story stronger, it would be cutting all 4 of them outside of Ryan, Graham, and Yaz's scene at the very end. I appreciate that they're already separated from the Doctor for enough of the story that she feels left to weather these earth-shattering revelations on her own, but I'd also adore it if the tension of the Doctor and Ruth scenes played out over more of the episode. It would also maybe be cool if the Judoon themselves didn't feel so lost in the sauce of everything else going on, as the story approaches some really timely commentary on aggressive policing that doesn't really go anywhere. Regardless, the performances all shine in this one, Whittaker and Joe Martin especially, and it had my attention locked in, especially in the back half. I like Praxeus a lot. It's a really solid episode that I think could have been a really great one if it lent a bit heavier on the concepts and character drama and a bit lighter on the exposition. It's the second story by Kerblam writer Pete McTighe, and the two stories definitely share a vibe. They're both pretty straightforward but interesting and unique sci-fi conflicts. Both have somewhat sympathetic antagonists in disguise as benevolent supporting characters who perform inhumane experiments on people, etc. Praxeus struggles a little more than Kerblam did in giving everyone in the cast stuff to do, and like I said, the dialogue is a smidge too expository and techno-babbly, but when it does stop to focus on the drama and the ideas, it's compelling. Suki and her whole plot are super interesting, as is how the Doctor reacts to them. Frankly, I wish that were all a bigger focus. Adam is an engaging side character with a fully formed arc, and he and Jake are sweet. The TARDIS crew all get fun little moments. I could go on. Gabriella is a character the story probably could have done without, I think, but overall I think this one deserves a bit more recognition. Can You Hear Me is one of those stories that I think exemplifies the entire Chibnall Era really well and reflects my thoughts on the whole oeuvre. It's full of ideas and themes and moments that I like a lot, understated but effective bits of humor, intriguing high-concept plot, a very grounded sense of drama, pointed symbolism and metaphor, and companion characterization that feels more meaningful and revealing with the benefit of hindsight for Ryan and Yaz here especially. Unfortunately, it also reflects the era's recurring problems with rushed plot resolutions, one-off characters who are interesting on paper but not done a full service, and worst of all is the tendency of stories in this era to be just not very exciting. For someone like me, the character work and ideas can sustain a run of stories like this, but it was watching this one where it fully sunk in that the Chibnall years lacked a real kinetic energy that the RTD and Moffat terms have/had. Inject that energy into this story and also give it 5 to 10 more minutes to play out more naturally, and we'd have a really solid one on our hands. The Haunting of Villa Diodati is just soaking, dripping in pure horror atmosphere. It's maybe the most straightforward horror piece the show's ever done, all gothic and macabre, and it definitely feels like the atmosphere was the story's top priority with a bullet. The characterization and structure is all solid too, but even when this story reveals itself as part 1 of a 3-part finale, with the arrival of half Cyberman Ashad, the vibe is unrelenting. Ashad himself is such a visually, tonally dark and oppressive baddie. In a lesser episode, I feel like the mere presence of something as explicitly sci-fi as the Cybermen would threaten to take this out of the horror genre, but right up till everything resolves, the visuals, music, performances, and plot here, everything minus some sparing comic relief from Ryan and Graham, it all pours into taking this one deadly, morbidly serious. It's the story's commitment to tone and vibe that I think makes it the strongest of Series 12. Did you know I talk about Marvel and Kingdom Hearts sometimes? Click the related video to listen to me talk at length about both and how I'd cross them over. Any 2-part finale that paired the Master and Cybermen again so soon after World Enough in Time and the Doctor Falls was always doomed to pale in comparison, and Ascension of the Cybermen and the Timeless Children pales indeed. Ascension in particular is an utter snooze where it feels like almost nothing happens. The Timeless Children is actually the more watchable of the 2 parts. I'd even say it's a mostly good episode, mainly because of how ludicrously hard Sacha Dhawan goes. Underneath all the smiles and mayhem, his master's dripping, gushing with rage and heartbreak at his lost sense of self in every line, which almost justifies the big twist all on its own. There's other scattered ideas and character moments here that I think work, but he is really what saves the story, and it's all the Timeless Child parts of these 2 episodes that actually engage me. If it's a scene of Dhawan and Whittaker playing off each other, then I genuinely think it's great stuff, compelling ideas on paper elevated by great performers. Unfortunately, all the Cyberman stuff largely falls flat, and this is another bloated 2-parter that could have been reworked into 1-hour-length episode. Revolution of the Daleks is a sequel to Resolution from the previous year, and while I found Resolution to be almost revelatory in how well it held up, this one is still plenty enjoyable, but also much less focused. It shares strengths with its predecessor, mainly being a great final showcase for Ryan. I've come to really love and appreciate Ryan's character over these 2 series, and his scenes with the Doctor here display so much character growth and got me genuinely teary-eyed in spots. In a lot of ways, Ryan was the heart of Series 11 and 12, and I'm gonna miss him and Graham. It's also a decent showcase for the Daleks, though ultimately their whole plot feels like a background to the character stuff. On that note, while John Barrowman and Chris Noth are both far from anyone's good graces, this last appearance from Jax, Harkness, and Robertson are fun. Arachnids is really just here to be a friendly face that breaks some tension, and I can't help but appreciate Noth's screen presence, which feels very unique for this show. Between all these different story elements though, that lack of focus is a real issue. The episode doesn't quite have time to give a real meaty dramatic impact to anything but Ryan and Graham's departure. Series 12 has been kind of a disappointing revisit, not in the sense that I didn't enjoy myself with it or that I got nothing out of it, but it's an extremely rare occasion where I don't think there's any all-time great or noteworthy bangers in it. Diodati comes close, but while the batting average here is better than, say, Series 7, it's largely a string of flawed but watchable ones, with only one or two super solid ones, and Ascension of the Cybermen and Orphan 55 as the big noteworthy L's. There's just kind of a vibe about this season, the sense that it could be a marked improvement on Series 11, that at least half the stories could be totally peak, but something just felt off. It all comes back to that problem I mentioned before of Chibnall's style being fairly unexciting. It's a series full of great ideas and great moments, stuck in stories that don't capitalize on them to make great episodes. Flux is, for all intents and purposes, a single massive Doctor Who story told over the course of a whole season, and while I don't love that choice on principle, the Halloween apocalypse is a pretty solid setup that effectively conveys a sense of scale and menace. It's not very spooky or scary, which is a shame for what's ostensibly a Halloween special, but this episode is basically Act 1 of a really long Doctor Who movie, and there's so much going on I can understand spook factor not being a priority. There's a lot being juggled, and a lot of pieces being set up on the board here, and as set up, I think it's all really interesting. The Doctor and Yaz, heck even just Yaz as an individual, finally start to form something of a dynamic here. The cadre of villains being introduced or reintroduced all pique my interest, Dan makes an endearing impression, and everything comes together to really sell the Flux itself as this unprecedented massive threat. Flux as a series is going to be a little hard to talk about in chunks, but as its own hour of television, I think this episode stands pretty strong. It's a pleasant surprise. War of the Sontarans is Flux Part 2, and it's slightly weaker than Halloween Apocalypse solely on account of what I'll call the connective tissue parts of this miniseries. The villains Swarm and Azir and the planet called Time, it's also immediately abstract and difficult to parse for me, that I just feel unmoored from the story when they're the focus. They make for another great ending cliffhanger, I'll admit, and they're definitely the C-plot of this episode, but when this one works, it's purely on the strength of the Sontaran A and B plots. This story captures an absurd tragedy to the Sontarans that the rest of the modern era never manages to, I think, and it subtly positions 13's specific attitude and quirks in a way that make her maybe the best Doctor to foil the Sontarans in method and ideology. Dan also continues to make a big impression, though his character is so borderline farcical it threatens to become odd in an off-putting way rather than endearing. I feel like I'd love this one if it were a standalone, though it's also possible future context will make me appreciate the parts I currently find less palatable. While the previous two episodes were very much part of one long ongoing story, Once Upon a Time is the first part of Flux I can't really treat at all like a standalone episode. It does have a backstory for the new character Vinder with a beginning, middle, and end at least, and I find that stuff all pretty cool. Vinder and his lover Belle are both likable characters. I want to see them reunited, and their journey is the narrative spine for an episode that's otherwise all about providing context for what's to come. What I'll say is that it feels like Chibnall is taking advantage of having so many episodes to tell one story. The guy loves big esoteric concepts, which usually get disserviced by being delivered in paragraphs of rushed exposition. Here, he takes a whole hour to parse out bits of answers and backstory that would normally be glossed over, and it's kept me wanting to know more about the actual plot. Whittaker does a fantastic job playing the Doctor's desperation for those answers, just continually impressing me with her performance. That said, I feel like much of this one will live and die with how well it's paid off later. Village of the Angels is a weird one. Not structurally or tonally or anything, more just in the feelings it brings out in me. I've never loved the Weeping Angels the way so much of fandom has, but I've appreciated their fear factor enough that a base under siege story, with them at the center, should carry me to satisfaction. There's a slowly unraveling mystery here, a big twist at the end that ties everything back to the arc of the miniseries, the Doctor doing doctory stuff, and a cool new supporting character in the form of Jericho, but I don't know, I just end this episode, and in spite of all that, I don't feel like I'd have missed much if I skipped it. The spooky, tense atmosphere works, but this episode isn't the mood piece. It's a very, very plot-driven puzzle designed to get the Doctor from A to B, and my only reaction when it all finished was that it could probably get the same idea across in a fraction of the time, and I'd care about as much. I like Survivors of the Flux a lot, probably my favorite episode of the miniseries. Certainly the one where I'm most enjoying all of the various subplots and never feeling as though any one storyline is a drag on the episode around it. Yaz, Dan, and Jericho having spent 3 years off-screen as archaeologist adventurers at the dawn of the 20th century is a super interesting setup, and I like their trio dynamic. The Grand Serpent undermining UNIT through the decades is an intriguing mystery with a killer reveal at the end. Recurring elements finally start to build to a head, but paramount to all of that is the scenes between the Doctor and Tecteun. For the first time in 60 years, the Doctor comes face to face with what's ostensibly their parent, and Barbara Flynn and Jodie Whittaker take full advantage of that narrative opportunity. The range of emotion between the two is captivating. The disdain, the disappointment, the cruelty, and the affection and longing buried deep beneath. It genuinely hurts a bit to watch in a good way. This is one that I had such a good time with, I want to go back and smack myself in the past for dismissing it. The Vanquishers sets out to aggressively tie up every loose end that the Flux has presented up to now. In my opinion, it manages to do so in a way that's largely satisfying. Certain dramatic beats or character exits feel rushed, and the story suffers from the previous episode's decision to take Tecteun off the board unceremoniously, but the three-pronged plot here between the Sontarans, the Ravagers, and the Grand Serpent is one that I really enjoy. My biggest complaint is that as a finale to this run of episodes, Yaz and Dan have shockingly little to do with how they've not been given a concrete stake in any of the storylines left to be resolved. But Jodie Whittaker is fantastic as always, and now there's 3 of her. I think if the previous 5 episodes succeeded in getting you invested in these characters and plots, then this one should bring them all to a satisfying close. I used to hate Flux. I used to hate Flux. I found it totally incomprehensible, boring, and called it the nadir of the show for a long time. Thankfully, we've hit one of those times where past me was just being kinda dumb, I guess. Flux is far from flawless, but I reacted so much better to it than I could have ever expected on this viewing. Cared so much more about its ideas and characters and drama. I was really taken in by the performances here, and while Chibnall's still not winning any awards for dialogue, this miniseries contained some of his best writing in my opinion. And I took the decision to make this a connected miniseries way better than on first watch. You can tell how much Chibnall loves the Sontarans, something we have in common, because this series is the best showcase they've ever gotten in the modern era, practically the definitive Sontaran story. The Doctor's desperation for answers also gives this one an energy that series 11 and 12 lacked. Biggest issues are that the 2 middle episodes didn't quite hit for me, and Yaz is a character who's still largely disserviced outside of episode 5. But man, if you're like me and haven't watched or thought about Flux in a long time, I recommend you give it another shot. Eve of the Daleks is... it's fine. It positions itself as kind of a coda to Flux, but doesn't have anything to add to what that story was saying. As a standalone story, it's got some funny moments, a neat premise, and charming side characters, but there's very little memorable about it. The thing that stands out most is a firm negative, and that's how this is the story that makes me realize I don't really like the Doctor and Yaz dynamic. Like, at all. It's the first story to overtly confirm Yaz having romantic feelings for the Doctor, and the way it all plays out has the opposite of the intended effect, where I'm just left thinking that these two would be really bad for each other, that I've watched their relationship be utterly stagnant without any meaningful progression or deepening for the last dozen or so episodes. Romantically or platonically, this is the straw that broke the camel's back and made these two my definitive least favorite TARDIS pairing. The way this story ends really put me in kind of a poor mood, definitely the weakest of the New Year's specials. I've watched Legend of the Sea Devils twice, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I still don't actually feel like I've seen this episode. This might sound weird, I don't know, but paying attention to this story is hard. Both now and when it aired, I found myself regularly spacing out, missing big chunks of scenes, and yet feeling like I'd missed nothing at all. The big issue here is how cripplingly plot-centric it is. 90% of the dialogue here is exposition or furthering plot points or establishing a MacGuffin or plot device, and I don't think that's exaggerating. It's all just plot, just events happening with no thematic or emotional grounding. When we get to the final moments, we actually get some decent emotional material for the Doctor and Yaz, which addresses the issues I've had with their relationship and frames it all in a pretty tragic way. That part hits, but nothing with the Sea Devils or ancient Chinese pirates that we spent 40 minutes on beforehand complements that brief slice of character work. It almost feels like Chibnall thought of that one scene and then slapped together a premise, and only a premise, to fill the runtime leading up to it. It's crazy that Power of the Doctor manages to outclass the last 3 regeneration stories by virtue of being mostly okay. In all seriousness, this one left me with a lot of complicated feelings that I had to sit on. It's kind of a big mess, and it's hurt by leaning so hard on Sacha Dhawan, who's giving a weirdly off-his-game performance that tips over into annoying rather than compelling. It's the first story to feature the Master, Daleks, and Cybermen, but the latter 2 factions have very little to do. What makes it all worth it is a very strong thematic core about the value of the companions, and the Doctor's biggest strength being their ability to make friends. The scenes of Ace and Tegan are all absolutely killer. What really muddles it, though, is how the end of the 13th Doctor frames her tenure, and especially her relationship with Yaz, as deeply sad and tragic in a way I don't know if Chibnall intended. So much of it is a big, explosive roller coaster of a story, but then it sucker punches you with this intricate, melancholy feeling about where this Doctor ended up emotionally, and I can't decide if I appreciate it or find it off-putting. So, in keeping with what's kind of become the trend of these sections of these videos, this is ending up much like the Peter Capaldi era sort of wrap-up section, where I actively started taking notes for this one before I properly finished the era, or even really got that far in, but am not doing it entirely scripted. My initial plan was actually to have my thoughts on the Chibnall era be the first one that are entirely scripted out, because I just kind of liked the sort of asymmetry, I guess might be the word. I liked the idea that having done 4 of these videos now, that without me really planning to, each era kind of got discussed after the shorts were all through in a different way. I don't know, I just kind of liked the idea that each Doctor's era would come with this kind of retrospective part that was written out and scripted and planned in a slightly unique fashion to the other Doctors, but that's all kind of arbitrary. The way that it actually shook out was I had a lot of stuff written down, and I'm mainly pulling from that, but also will be ad-libbing a few other points as they come to me. So hopefully it's not a terrible listen, but here we go. So I'm not gonna lie, ever since I started this project all those months back, the Chibnall era is the one that I had the most anticipation for revisiting. And the reason for that is because I think it's the era of the show that most needed the distance from the sort of fandom surrounding it at the time. Because the Chibnall era had, like, if you're watching this video, you know, very, very pervasive fandom hatred for it as it aired. And, you know, obviously with the female Doctor, that a lot of stupid people didn't care for, and the rise of the whole anti-woke online discourse occurring in tandem with this era. Like, it's easy to forget, especially if you're someone who's much younger than me, but this constant, never-ending amateur media cycle of people complaining about wokeness and stuff in sort of nerd media, or really just any media, it's become that pervasive. That whole thing is a extremely recent development. It kind of had its beginnings and then hit its fever pitch as this era was new. Like, it's crazy to think how different the online atmosphere and the way that this show was discussed was even just as recently as Twice Upon a Time. And then it feels like just in the lead up to Jodie Whittaker's era, something changed, and the way that fandom discusses not just this show, but any show, movie, any property, was irrevocably changed for the worse. And that was not a slow process, but it was very much an ongoing process throughout Jodie's time on the show. So if you combine that with how a lot of Doctor Who fans were just not enthused about the prospect of Chris Chibnall being the man in charge, because unlike me, a lot of people didn't care for his episodes previously, it was all just a big quagmire of negativity that surrounded this era before it even started, and I'm happy to be able to watch the era much more disconnected from all that. Because before it was kind of like watching the show in a haze, where it's hard to tell what's your reaction to the show and what's your reaction to the discourse. And if you've followed me long enough and you've sort of caught the pattern in how I write my videos, you know that I'm a very reflexive writer in terms of where my opinion fits in among other fans, where my opinion fits in relative to something's critical reception or fandom reception. it's a habit that I started, I don't even know when, but I don't think I can really stop it at this point. It's just kind of a facet of how I write things. And a real benefit for this whole show, but especially this era, in doing that with so much relatively older stuff in these shorts, is that I can distance myself from that habit. And it's also a benefit of the short format, less than a minute, forcing me to not do quite so much reflexiveness and quite so much fashioning what I have to say around pre-existing discourse. I really just had to force myself to sit down and take every episode purely on its own merits, divorced from what anyone else might have to say or think about it. And I think that's something that really benefited this era, and something that this sort of 3.5, I guess, seasons really, I think, ultimately came out better for. Like, really, I feel like I'm underestimating it, because it shouldn't be understated how much this era was improved for me as a viewing experience by just being able to get through it without the 5-year stretch of having every episode, every announcement, every interview punctuated with some kind of bad faith narrative. But to get into the actual quality of the show in retrospect, because this is another one where I'm recording this bit of the video about a month, maybe just slightly under a month from having finished Power of the Doctor. So the Chibnall Era now exists for me firmly in the rear view. So let's just talk about how it holds up, sort of, not in a vacuum, obviously, but the closest that we can get in a vacuum as its own self-contained run of episodes on the show. So I think another thing that kind of stands in the way of this era maybe being widely accepted, sort of a factor working against it, is the fact that it is coming off of the heels specifically of Steven Moffat. I'm of the opinion that if Chibnall's era, or if Chibnall had become showrunner directly after Russell T Davies, then people probably wouldn't be as annoyed with some of his writing habits as they are this being the thing that comes right after Moffat's writing. Because the thing about Steven Moffat's dialogue writing on this show is that it was often too clever for its own good, but in the effort to be clever, you could kind of admire it. By contrast, Chibnall's dialogue writing is quite dumbed down, and it's very dicey. And even in the Chibnall scripts that are functionally, structurally more solid than certain Moffat scripts, because there are plenty of those. There are plenty of Moffat scripts that I think are weaker than the average Chibnall script, but the dialogue and the snappiness of it is always something that Moffat was able to capture in a way that kept the momentum going. Like a recurring issue that I brought up in these shorts is a lack of energy, a lack of momentum. Part of that is just kind of how, not even always stilted, sometimes stilted, but always kind of not trying that hard the dialogue is. It's all very kind of standard, which, coming off of Moffat, who was always shooting for cleverness, who was always shooting for complexity and memorability in the lines that he would write, is a bit of a step down. Moffat was super economic with his dialogue is the thing. He liked to fill his scripts with people speaking figuratively or in double entendres, or making some kind of clever turn of phrase or quip, or having lines set up or pay off something thematically. And by comparison, Chibnall's dialogue is a lot of characters straightforwardly saying what they're thinking or making little comments that don't really add anything. So again, it's just Moffat's dialogue was clever to the point of being a little overbearing, you could feel how hard it was trying, and Chibnall, his dialogue swings way the heck in the other direction, and I think it's totally fair for people to have a very clear preference. That said, something that a lot of people also dislike about the Chibnall era, which I just can't get behind at all, especially this rewatch having changed some of my thoughts on it, is the characterization of the Doctor herself. Because Chibnall's Doctor and Jodie's Doctor is interesting. Like, I've come to appreciate her as a character a lot more than I have in the past. I've seen people accuse her of being generic, of not having any depth, of being kind of a standard Doctor with no frills attached and nothing that makes her special besides her gender. I've seen people call her inconsistent, say that she's poorly written in the sense that she feels like a different character episode to episode. And on this rewatch, I really gotta say that I can't see where any of that is coming from. I think her Doctor has a very clear vision as to who she is, and I think she stands out really clearly from other Doctors. And I don't know if she's in my top 5 Doctors or anything, but she's a really compelling and interesting take on the character to me. Because Doctor 13 is so specific and unique, and I think a lot of what I like about her is the reason others find her to be ill-defined or find her to be undoctorish. I'm gonna be completely honest, the other Doctor that I find her to be most comparable to in my mind is Patrick Troughton, is Doctor Number 2. Parts of her dialogue and performance belie the intelligence and the confidence and the sort of burden on her shoulders that we've all come to associate, especially with modern Doctors, but so much else about her speech and demeanor and the way that she carries herself and the constant second guessing that she has, all of that screams this little freak of nature who's just reacting to things. And I think that is a really interesting dichotomy that is always informing this character. And those are two sides that contrast each other and play off each other much more clearly than they do with any other Doctors. And I wonder if maybe that inherent dichotomy of the character and that contrast creates a dissonance for people, where they are not used to the character inhabiting such two clearly different modes moment to moment. But I think it all tracks if you're reading into it from a character place with her. And this is something that I've been really vocal about on Twitter since it kind of clicked for me going through this era. But for as much of a chipper and friendly Doctor as she is, 13 never hesitates to be confrontational and snide and condescending to her villains. And it's why, in any given episode from this era, really, the scenes of Jodie opposite the villains are almost guaranteed to be my favorite scenes. Because whenever she confronts a bad guy, it's like she's talking down to a literal child. And I really love it. And that's especially true when she's opposite the Daleks, but really it's true of all of the recurring villains that she faces, especially. If a villain shows up more than once, then they are really going to get schooled, because 13 has this hatred of her enemies that is so deep and so intense that it often goes full circle into becoming something petty and almost like childish bullying. More than any of the other modern Doctors, 13 is determined to make sure the bad guys feel belittled or disrespected like complete chumps. And what I really like is that when these kinds of moments would happen for Doctors 9 through 12, they were always treated like a switch-up. Like the attention was drawn to how the friendly and soft side of them receded for the angry, punitive side to take over. And it was framed as a transition from one aspect of the personality to the other. And for 13, I don't know if this is a writing choice or if it's just how Jodie performs, but it feels different with her in a way that I really like. It feels more alien because these feel like two sides of the character that are always there. And she doesn't so much switch between two modes as she is just flowing between them, from second to second almost. There will be moments in between one of her more intense scenes or one of her more intense bits of dialogue where she'll very quickly swap back to chipper and distractible and casual. And there will be beats in her chipper, casual, friendly moments where she suddenly hears something she doesn't like or sees something or sees something she doesn't like and becomes that bit more intense and punitive, and somehow she manages to make it work without it ever feeling like a whiplash, like in the way that it never takes me out of the scene. It always just feels like I'm watching this character who's always inhabiting both of these spaces. So a pattern that I've noticed with whenever I tend to revisit any piece of media really is, and again, it's not always, but it's enough that it is a pattern, is that when I do revisit something, I typically find that if I approached it critically the first time, then my thoughts in the present will often just be reinforcing thoughts that I had on my first critical approach. Again, obviously that's not always true. You just watched a lot of shorts in which I said episodes worked better or worse for me than they did on first viewing. But something that I definitely noticed was that watching through Series 11, almost all of my thoughts were just reinforcing feelings that I had back in 2017. And Series 11 is actually a series that I have videos on from when it aired, and I'd say that I'm tempted to revisit them and see exactly how my thoughts from back then hold up, but I'm really scared of what the audio quality on those is, because I don't know, that was before I had the microphone that I use now, whatever. But I am tempted to go back and see what thoughts I had at the time exactly that changed, but to my memory, I feel like things that I felt about Series 11 at the time were just felt more deeply on this viewing. And one of those things that I'm honestly curious about is how I felt at the time about the humor in this era, because unless I'm watching something with another person, then it's comparatively rare that anything will make me really laugh out loud. Even if I mentally acknowledge it as funny, I'm not the type of guy who will laugh to himself unless there's other people around to kind of share in the joke with, even when I'm hearing jokes for the first time. And I say all that to sort of preface the fact that I think the Chibnall Era is possibly the funniest era of the show, at least the modern series. And that's particularly impressive because there are times in episodes where I think a joke is well written, but aspects of the production will be working against it. I'm not going to talk a ton about Segu Nakanola's work on the score for this era. I generally think it's pretty okay. I sort of subscribe to the same thought process of DW Fan 91, who's got some really good videos, who mentioned in his video about the show that if Murray Gold had scored this run of episodes, then it would probably be met with a lot more appreciation and praise. And I think part of that, which is where I think he was coming from on that point, is just that Murray Gold has the vibes and this kind of cozy, nostalgic sort of musical identity that the show had been given that has suddenly changed, and sort of primes people to feel what the show wants you to feel. But also I think part of that is just that there's some really odd choices made in certain episodes with music cues. One that really sticks out in my mind is Eve of the Daleks, which opens with what I feel like is meant to be a joke and would probably land as a really funny one if the score wasn't playing it dead serious. I think there's little moments of that throughout the era, and yet in spite of that, this is the era that's got the most out loud laughs out of me. So speaking of patterns that I've noticed about myself that aren't true all the time, I've realized that a fairly reliable metric for how much I appreciate a story is how much I want to one day make a full-length 15 to 20 minute video reviewing just that episode. And I say it's fairly reliable because there's stories that I don't necessarily love completely, or which I think have big flaws, which that's also true for. Like, I've realized in recent months that The Doctor's Daughter is a story I could make a full video on, but I'd never count that as one of my favorites. But for the most part, if my thought when watching an episode is, I have a full video's worth of stuff to say about this, then that means it's really doing it for me. And the result of that is that there's a lot of stories in this era that I think deserve that treatment, and which I see get dismissed or ignored or criticized in a way that I really can't get behind, because my thought when I finish them is like, man, I wish I could just like lather praise on choices that this story makes for like half an hour. And again, I'm mainly largely talking about Series 11 when I say that, because the stories that like come to mind when I think of what that applies to, it's Kerblam, it's The Woman Who Fell to Earth, It Takes You Away, Resolution, obviously Demons of the Punjab, which I've already done. And like, I don't think it's an unpopular opinion to say that Series 11 is the best of the Chibnall Era, but even that series, I think, gets unfairly dismissed. And I don't know, I really think there's episodes in the Chibnall Era that if people revisited, in Series 11 especially, would become like outright classics and deserve to be outright classics. That said, I think increasingly as the Chibnall Era goes on, it starts to become a problem, and I talk about this in the Can You Hear Me short, where I mentioned that for me, the Chibnall Era is defined by moments and ideas more than it is by stories. It's full of moments and ideas that are interesting or fun to think about or funny, but so rarely does that translate to entire episodes. Like I've already talked about how there's a pattern of this era of the show not being very exciting. I'd argue that it's the only era of the show that, even though it made me laugh the most, that's all isolated moments. It's kind of interesting that I don't think the Chibnall Era has any real capital C comedy episodes. Like something like The Haunting of Villa Diodati stands out really well because it leans so much into horror, and it has the clear mission statement of being a genre thing. And in the RTD and Moffat eras, that felt like it was much more common, where you would have capital H horror episodes, capital C comedy episodes. And while the Chibnall Era is much more about sort of more esoteric settings and ideas and plots, it really misses out, I think, on not having episodes that tonally branch out much more than quote-unquote generic sci-fi. Like, it's always so fun to me when Doctor Who leans into a genre and makes that the thing for that story, and that never really happens in the Chibnall Era. Not beyond The Haunting of Villa Diodati. Again, it's all about moments. It's all about being scary in moments, or funny in moments, or heartfelt in moments. And full episodes never really commit in that way. And I think that's really unfortunate for the era, because I think that contributes to the feeling that a lot of people have, which is that the era is kind of monotone and like start to finish kind of just feels of a piece in the bad way. Like, not to harp on the point too much, but there is no divide or interesting gap between two episodes of the Chibnall Era in the way that there is a really interesting sort of tonal aesthetic divide between, say, The Unicorn and the Wasp versus Midnight, or The Runaway Bride versus the Family of Blood episodes. Stuff that's relatively close to each other, but if you'd changed the lead character and just had these two distinct pieces of television with their tones and settings being what they are, you could almost convince someone that you're watching two different shows. That feeling is never achieved in the Chibnall Era, I don't think, and it works against it. So let's talk some about the companions, because Ryan, Graham, Yaz, and Dan are really interesting in the sense that they're the only modern era companions who kind of get dragged into that role and get dragged on adventures not by choice. Moffat and Russell both typically had a companion sort of meet the Doctor, go on a little adventure, and they would get the moment of not even like crowning, but like initiation, where the Doctor gives them a choice. It's like, this is what I do, this is the types of stuff that I experience, would you like to come with me? And the companion is just, that type of person who would naturally complement that lifestyle, and they're like, yeah, let me do that. I want to experience life this way. And I think it's a really interesting choice by Chibnall to almost never have that be the case. Which I just like that, because it stops the companions as a whole concept from feeling too monotonous. Like, yes, I think we need that. I think we need companions who come into the show in different ways, who aren't just people that the Doctor meets and then they go on an adventure and then they're like, do you want to come with? And the companion says, yeah, and then they're off. I think if you do that too many times in a row, then it starts to feel rote and formula, and it really honestly had by the time we got to, I want to say, Clara. So yeah, having companions who sort of end up in the companion role because of different circumstances than just they meet the Doctor, go on an adventure, and then they choose to do that, I think speaks to Chibnall coming at the show from a different angle than Russell and Moffat did, which is something the show really needed, I think, at that stage. But to talk about them more individually, I talked about how a lot of my rewatch of Series 11 was reinforcing stuff that I felt in 2017. And the big difference, I'd argue, the biggest one between 2017 and now, is how much I've come to appreciate Ryan. And the fact that Series 11 is really Ryan's season, and in large part the emotional arc of both Series 11 and 12, when it's not about the Doctor, is Ryan's story. Because it's super funny to me how I go into this feeling like, in my memory, as I'm starting this era again, the character dynamic that I feel like is least served is the Doctor and Ryan. That's my thought going into this rewatch. That's the feeling that I'd had for the last couple years, is that those two are what my mind remembers having potential for a really cool relationship that never gets to actually happen, and that of all the different combinations of the team, those two spend the least amount of time together. And then I actually do the rewatch, and on this viewing, I feel like that couldn't have been more wrong. Like, Ryan's the emotional heart of Series 11 and 12 for me, and he's also just often the most endearing in terms of moments that make me smile or laugh. I don't often talk about the actors' performances in these sections, but I always feel bad when I see people dismiss Tassin Cole as a bad actor, and especially when these seasons were airing, I saw it happen a lot. Really, he's the only companion actor on the show that I've seen people be so comfortable with dismissing the performance and the acting talent of, and I feel like it's really unfair. I think he's really good, especially at the comedy. Ryan is kind of a silly, goofy dude in a lot of moments, and in those moments I think Cole delivers it great. I had this moment when I was watching Praxeus, when I thought to myself, he's the kind of actor I feel really bad for, because he seems just talented enough to make Ryan a good companion, but not talented enough to make him a great one, when I think the material for Ryan to be a great companion exists on the page. It's a thing that happens naturally all the time in media, but just stuck out to me here for whatever reason, where you have a good character paired with a good performer who does service to the role but doesn't elevate it, except for these rare moments. Because I think Cole does elevate the material in stories like Resolution, and he's a big reason I think Resolution is one of the best stories in this era. But to get back to Ryan's relationship with the Doctor, I was kind of shocked on revisit to see how consistently we would get these glimpses into Ryan and the Doctor as two people who really admire and like and respect each other. And there's so much there in the subtext of their relationship that I read into, and I wish it was just brought a bit more to the fore, because it's actually a great relationship dynamic that I think most people don't pick up on for how subtle it is. Where the Doctor enters the show as like, it's a new Doctor, it's a new lease on life, and she's got this deep, deep sense of confidence even when she's being kind of awkward. Meanwhile, Ryan is kind of the opposite, where initially he puts up this strong front, but there's a lot of insecurity underneath this facade of like a tough guy. And in a lot of little ways, Series 11 sees the Doctor being kind of a rock for Ryan, debatably even more than Graham is. And then Series 12 has a lot of the Doctor's confidence and sense of self rattled, and a now mature and wizened Ryan gets to be the rock for her. And they just have a really sweet, understated, reciprocal dynamic, which I love, and it creates this really sad contrast between the Doctor and Yaz. Because I think what happens is Ryan grows and matures and decides he needs to be there to protect Earth, and it can't be helped, and the Doctor wouldn't dare protest, but when he leaves and takes Graham with him, the Doctor, I think, breaks even further and starts keeping Yaz at super emotional arm's length to avoid feeling the pain of when she inevitably leaves too. And, it's futile. That kind of emotional defense mechanism is always futile. And the relationship between the Doctor and Yaz is one I really wish the show had spoken on more explicitly, or even just spent more time on. Because just like the relationship with Ryan, there's a lot under the surface there, but it's also tragic, and I wish we had more story told about that tragedy and the unfairness of this relationship. Because Eve the Daleks is really where it hit me how the Doctor and Yaz's relationship had been so stagnant. That, Legend of the Sea Devils, and Power of the Doctor together really clicked it into place for me, how emotionally odd these two are together, and how I don't really like the Doctor and Yaz together, but I could be made to like them if I was just more sure that the point was that they were kind of all wrong for each other. Because the thing is, they shouldn't be wrong for each other, right? On paper, Yaz is exactly the kind of person who should have a dynamic with the Doctor like Clara, where she and the Doctor actually have a ton in common, and Yaz almost wants to be the Doctor. But where 12 let Clara get way, way too close, until they were fully toxic levels of codependent, 13 has the opposite thing, where she pushes Yaz all the way away, and never really stops doing that. Their relationship ends in Power of the Doctor, with 13 still pushing Yaz away, and what I'd love is if we had a callback to Clara, or even Rose, where the Doctor made note of how maybe in another life she would have let Yaz in like that, but those relationships ended poorly. Because when we get to the Power of the Doctor and the end of all this, I just wish I knew if the show was aware of how melancholy 13's arc as a character actually was. It's almost an exact inverse to 12, because where 12 built up this sense of identity and openness and peace with himself from Series 8 to Twice Upon a Time, from Series 11 to Power of the Doctor, we see 13 lose more and more of herself and just isolate and internalize absolutely everything. And it's horrifyingly sad when you think about it, but it's not framed that way. It almost feels like it happened on accident. Like the dominoes just happened to fall into place to create this consistent, logical character progression for 13 that is a massive downer. Like, I always think, what would have happened if Tossin Cole and Bradley Walsh hadn't left the show exactly when they did? What would have happened if Ryan could have made it back for Power of the Doctor? If they left earlier, or if they left later, or if they never left at all? It was this sense of 13 slowly breaking down inevitable. Taking it on its own terms, not worrying about if it's purposeful or accidental, if I just accept that the story we have is the story we have, and it's this downbeat character breakdown with a quote-unquote main doctor-companion relationship in Yaz and 13 that spent 3 series never getting off the ground, then I think it's a really interesting story that holistically is a really hard-to-swallow pill. Not even in a bad way, it's just tough, in that way that all tragedy is tough. And, since I've started doing this, it's been announced that there will be Big Finish audio dramas starring 13 and Yaz, and given that there's a pretty small window between Series 12 and Flux that those stories could possibly take place in, I'm really curious what the take on the relationship between the two of them will be in those audios, and I'm really eager to listen to those and see how those two come off and how I feel about their dynamic after getting some more stories with them alone together. On a lighter note, the Doctor and Graham, I think, are just funny. They're just two people who are friends due to proximity, but neither of them really gets the other. They're kind of like Pierce and Abed on Community in that sense. The way that those two were kind of an underrated pairing because they were the two characters in the group who really just could not see where the other was coming from at any given moment, more than anybody else. Like, I think 13 and Graham make for some really good comedy where either Graham or the Doctor will say something or approach something in a certain way, and you can just tell that the other person would never, ever think of things that way. It's just a really charming little thing that never gets too much focus, but I don't know, I find it endearing the way that those two are just never on the same wavelength. And obviously, I should probably also talk about Dan. I'd believe it if you told me that after Bradley Walsh and Tossin Cole decided to leave, Chibnall conceived of Dan as, consolidating those two characters, because he kind of carries vibes of both Graham and Ryan. I like that he's really a bit of a weirdo, and I like the way that he traded barbs with Yaz, and those both feel like the Ryan side of him. And Yaz and Dan together is the most that I ever enjoy Yaz, because it's a relationship where she's actually allowed to be a somewhat equal. And Dan plays into the Doctor's tragedy, I think, because the two of them seem like they vibe fairly well almost immediately, but then almost immediately again, Dan is gone in a blink. And a lot of people don't care for how he was written out of power in the Doctor so early, but for me, it did really well to set the tone and themes of that story, to have that be a relationship that's gone almost as soon as it starts, and very unceremoniously. Because then that's a story about whether or not the Doctor has been a good, net positive presence in her companions' lives long term, and the sort of insecurity she has about her relationships with her friends that ultimately gives way to the fact that these are still people who love her and who want to be with her, and who, even when their time together is done, will still come together to help her. And I think that's something that really ties that whole story together and is nicely set up by the way that Dan is handled. And you know what? While we're talking about companions, I also want to talk about Grace, because I think Grace, just as a character, gets under-discussed, almost never comes up in, holistic discussions of this era, and yet I really like the way that she's handled as kind of a posthumous companion, almost. And I talked in the short about Arachnids in the UK about Grace as a figurative spectre, and how I prefer that to her being a literal visual ghost. But what I like about Grace is that she really has the makings of the ideal companion, in the way that Clara kind of eventually fashioned into the ideal companion. And funny enough, how another Grace is kind of ideal for her Doctor in the 96 movie, but this Grace, she's the one who you would think would take best to TARDIS life and most easily, because she is the one who takes everything in stride, who accepts all of the alien sci-fi stuff without much protest. She's the one who is most proactive. She's the one who has the most integrity. And then she dies. And for Series 11 and small parts of Series 12, but mostly up through Resolution, there is this emotional arc of like, ah, man, it sucks that Grace couldn't be here because she would love this. Like, she would love traveling with the Doctor. And just, there's that. It's not done enough to where it's overbearing. It's brought up exactly enough times for where I'm sat there going, this is a really pointed, interesting, thematic, storytelling thing that Chibnall is doing. Where he makes me feel sad that we have a TARDIS team of 4 when we could have had a TARDIS team of 5 with this woman who just saw the best in life and could have been a really positive influence on all of the others. And who knows what sort of things that Ryan, Graham, Yaz, and the Doctor all went through emotionally that they could have maybe had a little bit more of a pillar of strength in if Grace had still been around. And so she feels like the 5th main character of the show for Series 11, in that sense of her loss remains conspicuous, even though she's always off screen. And you get the sense that Ryan and Graham especially are always thinking about her. And I don't know, I think it's a really, really neat thing that they pull off that I wouldn't get to bring up more than like a single sentence in a given short, but it's something that I wanted to talk about because I don't know how intentional it was, but that feeling of like wishing that Grace had survived to see the rest of the show and to see these people that she knows grow is like, it's palpable. Like, I feel it consistently. That said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The fam, quote unquote, our foursome of the Doctor, Ryan, Graham, and Yaz are often met with derision, not even derision, but like criticism, treated as one of the lower tier TARDIS teams, even independent of the individual episode writing. And I don't necessarily agree, but I kind of get it. And the reason that I get it is because I think too much of the character growth and relationship building and dynamics is subtext, and certain things that I think would be key to making this foursome dynamic as memorable, as emotionally powerful as a Doctor and Rose, Doctor and Donna, Doctor and Amy, Doctor and Martha, 12 and Clara. I think the character beats and relationship beats like those happen sometimes, and when they do happen, they're very sweet and get like an explicit focus and spotlight. But sometimes they just happen off screen, and it's like we're skipping over things, or like we're putting off moments that we could have used earlier to really cement what the character relationship is. Because in my mind, like the way that I laid out the Doctor and Ryan's relationship, I think is something that I'm able to pick up on, but it really only becomes super clear in the text what the idea there is when Ryan's almost gone. Because it's that moment in Resolution where they talk to each other where it really becomes obvious that, like, Ryan is now the Doctor's pillar in a way that the Doctor had been a pillar for Ryan before. And if we just gotten more moments like that, or even moments where we had the characters acknowledge what the dynamic is, then I think it could have been interesting. And there's moments where I'm just like, really it's one moment, because what I'm thinking of right now is how baffled I was watching Fugitive of the Judoon, and having that story begin with establishing that the Doctor regularly leaves Ryan, Graham, and Yaz on their own for hours at a time in order to make regular trips back to Gallifrey's ruins. Because, like, obviously I don't need to see the Doctor visit Gallifrey and just, like, look at its ruins multiple times. We got it the one time at the end of Spyfall, and that was evocative. But This idea that she is doing that on the regular and not taking her companions with her, making a conscious choice to leave them behind while she does this private thing for herself, like, that is a great idea as a character beat in their relationship and, like, telling us a little something about the 13th Doctor and where she's at in Series 12. That is a genius, like, little thing. Like, that she basically leaves them to loiter aimlessly while she does something private and doesn't tell them about it. But not seeing the process of that, not seeing them get left behind ever, the audience only ever finding out that she's doing this in the episode where she stops doing it, is a really bizarre choice, and it really undercuts the impact of that idea. And I think this era is full of little things like that, little choices that undercut the power of character dynamics that do exist for these guys. And again, I think that's true of the Doctor and Yaz as a duo, and it's just, I don't know, it's character stuff that gets dropped into expository dialogue, and that again comes to Chibnall's dialogue writing. Like that thing I just talked about in The Fugitive of the Judoon, that's the kind of thing that people should remember or talk about when discussing how Chibnall handled Gallifrey, and it never comes up because it's near impossible to notice or remember because you just dropped it into a paragraph of dialogue instead of letting us see it happen. So this rewatch was very much a solidification of things I'd sort of vaguely thought in regards to Ryan, Graham, and Yaz previously, and one of those things is the fact that Ryan is definitely my favorite of the three, and unfortunately this ties into a consistent issue with the era that I'll touch on in a sec. But I've always had this thought with Ryan, Graham, and Yaz, where because there's three of them, they each sort of loosely fit into a kind of companion archetype, where Yaz is the companion who wants to be the Doctor, Graham is the companion who's just here for a good time, and Ryan is the one who's kind of like the Doctor's student, and who's here to grow as a person under the Doctor's quote-unquote tutelage. And like I said, they fit into these roles very loosely, but it really struck me on this watch where what I tend to remember is Ryan as the one of the three that the Doctor just didn't spend a lot of time with and didn't interact with a ton. But on this watch, I felt like that recollection, was inaccurate. In almost every episode, or every other episode, I was consistently struck by how often the Doctor and Ryan were paired together and made to bounce off each other in these little ways, to the point that it felt like it was slightly more the two of them than it was any other configuration while Ryan was around. And so many little character growth moments or kind of development check-ins that Ryan would have would be with or about the Doctor, and theirs would be the relationship I was most interested in seeing more of. So by the end of Ryan's time on the show, he's really grown to the point that he's able to be the mature adult who can ground the Doctor in her time of need. After the Timeless Children, the Doctor is in this very vulnerable place, and the implication I got from the subtext is that she's sort of been sent back to childhood emotionally, and having her be so lost and having no sense of self, while Ryan is there to help her through that, it's a really great showcase of this character and that relationship. I don't know, on this watch of this era, I was really magnetized by Ryan, and he'd always have these endearing or interesting moments that stole my attention. And I really do think there's a through line there that's intentional, where he is the companion who learns to be the best of himself with the Doctor's sort of guidance. But that brings us to the issue I mentioned, which is how this era has the beginnings and the endings of really neat arcs, but can forget about the connective tissue. And that's not always true, because Ryan has what I think is a really good fully formed arc across Series 11 about growing and maturing from this very impulsive person into a more competent, confident, realized, mature guy, and coming of age into this mature young man, and Series 12 lets us really see that young man in action. That's all good. I think that all works. And we see Ryan become more mature and cautious, without losing the side of himself that's a little silly and goofy. And I really think he's such an endearing character. But no, what I'm talking about is something like how we set up Ryan as the one most willing to use weapons, And in the Ghost Monument, that's tied in with his foolhardiness. And then we get to the Timeless Children, and suddenly he's unsure about if he wants to use weapons. And on paper, as two ends of an arc, that's good. But the Chibnall Era does this thing where smaller character traits like that don't get the attention they should. So the journey from A to B is neutered when you remember that just earlier in Series 12, in the Tesla episode, Ryan is super excited to still use weapons. And in between Tesla and Timeless Children, that trait is never touched on. It never becomes a conflict with the Doctor after the Ghost Monument. It just doesn't matter until it does. And it's little things like that which poke holes in all of these companions. Because Yaz suffers from a similar thing, where I don't think anyone can really tell me when and where Yaz's romantic feelings for the Doctor begin. She very clearly admires her from the moment they meet, and she's the biggest Doctor advocate in the cast, consistently. But we hit the Haunting of Villa Diodati and are suddenly given these hints of strong romantic feeling, and the moment that admiration became a crush is just never dramatized. When we get to Eve of the Daleks is when I realize that I actively do not like the Doctor and Yaz relationship at all, and that's mitigated a little bit by the sense that maybe there's a feeling of intentional tragedy there, but it's not just in the sense that I don't like Doctor-companion romances, or I don't think it was earned or anything like that. I don't like these two together because, with a very rare exception, Yaz doesn't actually seem like she likes being around the Doctor to me. Like, that is the big dissonance that I'm having, just with their dynamic, how I'm told I'm supposed to take it versus what I'm seeing on the screen. Because Eve of the Daleks is really when it hit me that watching through this show, Yaz almost never seems happy when she's in a scene with the Doctor. She always seems like she's either exasperated or annoyed or confused, and honestly, I don't blame her. The Doctor is emotionally evasive with Yaz to the point that their relationship just completely stagnates. Like, there is no real sense that they're closer or more open with each other or happier around each other as people from Series 12 to Eve of the Daleks. And that's insane to me. Even though Yaz is written to be very admiring toward the Doctor in scenes when they're not together in the same room, when they're together, her default expression is to be grimacing or rolling her eyes or shaking her head at the Doctor being weird or putting up walls between them. And the Doctor puts up those walls, like walls that would make the walls between Ten and Martha blush. And Graham is also funny because he's by far the most beloved thing about the Chibnall Era, and on this watch he didn't do a ton for me. And it's ironic because I remember back when these characters were announced, and the people were really annoyed at the prospect of Bradley Walsh being a companion because they thought it was just stunt casting. And yet, all this time later, people look on Graham as like the best thing about this era, and I'm like, yeah, he's funny, he's charming, but, you know, he doesn't stand out to me super, like a whole bunch. Outside of episodes that really give him a clear focus, Graham is very much there to be the comic relief, and he's an effective comic relief, but, yeah, he's not something that I necessarily look at as, like, the anchor of the era. For me, that's Ryan. So we've talked about companions a lot, and I'm realizing that this section is going on really long, but let's also talk about villains. And this is where I'll talk a bit about my feelings on the Timeless Child as a concept, because I am a Timeless Child defender. Like, I feel like, talk about the execution of that episode all you want. There are people who are, to this day, really, really, really mad about the choice to make the Doctor the Timeless Child and all that means. And I've seen people say that they would have liked it if they just did things with it. And I just cannot relate to or see where those people are coming from. My perspective is that the Timeless Child is a really interesting writing choice, and I think Chibnall did really interesting things with it. And the interesting things he did largely take the form of Tecteun and the Master. Because a take that I see fairly often is like people going, oh, it would have been so much cooler and so much more interesting if the Master was the timeless child. And I'm like, no, that would be infinitely less interesting. Because the thing is, the Master is Rey from the Star Wars sequels. And just like Rey in those movies, the worst thing for him to hear is that he is not the figure of significance. Because people approach it with the idea of, oh, if the Master was the timeless child, and the secret that had been kept from him was that he was the progenitor of the Time Lords, and they had erased his memories and made him do all this stuff, that would explain his anger and his rage and destroying Gallifrey. But to me, so much more interesting is the idea that the Master yearns for significance, and what drives him insane is that he doesn't have it, but the Doctor does. Like, to me, the single line of dialogue that most defines Sacha Dhawan's Master, and which I feel like really ties together the entire arc of Series 12 and The Timeless Children as an episode, is when he says, "A little piece of you is in me, and believe me when I say I cannot bear that," referring to the Doctor because of the whole timeless child thing. That idea that the Master, and this is why I like Dhawan's Master as a post-Missy Master, because to me, it is again this really tragic arc, and it takes the Doctor and Master both from a Missy and Capaldi, kind of the Doctor and the Master at their most triumphant, and makes the Chibnall Era just this slow tragedy of their relationship, where the Master tried really hard to be like the Doctor and to be someone that the Doctor could approve of, and then they died by their own hand before they got the chance. And then they find out that the Doctor is their progenitor, basically, and that a little piece of the Doctor is in them inherently. The paradox of that, of never being able to escape the Doctor's shadow but never being able to live up to them, would absolutely drive someone psychotic. And I love that. Like, people have made the argument that with the death of Missy and the Doctor falls, we had said all that we could say with the Master's character. I think Chibnall truly was ingenious in how he handled the Master, because I think he found the one other thing that you could say with this character and really put a capper on it, which is, okay, the Master had their phase of trying to be good and it failed. What if we revealed to them that on some level it was always futile, and that there is no escape from the Doctor's, like, orbit? What if the Master's arc was realizing that they could only ever be a satellite to the Doctor, and fighting and scratching and screaming and clawing until his fingers were bloody, trying to escape that truth, even to the point of trying to become the Doctor, trying to override them, and they can't. Like, it is truly so tragic, and I really love it. And I have my criticisms of Sacha Dhawan's performance in Power of the Doctor, but as written, I think Chibnall's Master is as good as Missy, if not better. Just a really, really, really definitively interesting take on the character. But on the other side of the Timeless Child thing, to take it away from the Master, and why I think it's, again, good that it was the Doctor for the Doctor's character, I want to talk some about Tecteun, because something that I really like about not just 13, but Chibnall's approach to the Doctor as a character whenever he writes for them, because you can see it in Tennant and you can see it in Smith, is Chibnall really likes emphasizing the Doctor's nature as a scientist, and emphasizing their love of exploration and the fields of science, And that is just all over any Chibnall written script. And I like the idea that those are the traits that are reflected in Tecteun. Were it not for the fact that they were killed super unceremoniously in Flux, I would have liked Tecteun to stick around and be a recurring villain on the show who pops up. And maybe they still can. Like, maybe we find a mumbo-jumbo way to say they survived the Ravagers, actually, because if I'm Russell T Davies, or if I'm anyone who's working on the show after Chris Chibnall, I'm bringing Tecteun back all the time, because the well of drama there is just ridiculous. Tecteun is the Doctor's parent, and the idea that the Doctor has their parent as their nemesis fascinates me. And the idea that we have all of these recurring bad guys who either lack something that the Doctor has or are reflections of their key traits. And for me, I think Tecteun is a really fascinating foil for the Doctor, because you could argue that Tecteun is the source of the Doctor's interest in exploration and interest in science and their insane risk-taking, because those are traits that have been with the Doctor since the beginning. And if you think about that level of influence, even if the Doctor only remembers it subconsciously because they had their memory erased, Tecteun is that explorer. She is that scientist. She is that insane risk-taker. And you totally believe that Tecteun's example would give us a Doctor like early Hartnell, the man who would do really selfish things out of scientific curiosity, or the man who needed to learn compassion from humans. And I think all of that is stuff that is inherent and is fascinating, and I would have liked to spend more Flux, at least, if not further episodes down the line, exploring that. Like, make Tecteun this Doctor's definitive nemesis, and really draw attention to that dynamic. Like, how much of the Doctor's personality comes from this person, and how much can we wring out of, like, the Doctor as the child who's outgrown their parent, and the child who tragically can see parts of themselves in the parent, but also can see the things that their parent lacks, and that dissonance and that feeling of disgust and disappointment and mutual disappointment, because Tecteun sees the compassion that the Doctor has learned and sees it as weakness. Like, I don't know, man. Like, there's a lot that I've come to appreciate about Flux. Like, on this rewatch, it's hit me how Flux is probably the biggest story that the modern series has ever attempted in terms of scale. And the fact that it has like 4 or 5 different villain factions, and it spans several millennia, and it ties back to the Doctor's origins, and the entire universe is at stake. And like, I've come to appreciate that a lot. And like, my big hot take is that, like, if you were gonna make an epic trilogy of Doctor Who movies, I think it would feel like Flux in tone and scale. And I really, really respect Chibnall for how ambitious all that is, but the one thing that really bugs me is how perfect the setup is with Tecteun, and how Jodie Whittaker and Barbara Flynn are both really trying to mine that drama, but the way that Flux is structured kind of cuts it off at the knees, and it's the biggest tragedy, I think. But yeah, no, I'll wrap this all up with, like, Flux as a series, because that is, I think, emblematic of this entire thing, where I'd revisited plenty of individual episodes from Series 11 and 12 often enough before doing this rewatch, but Flux is really the only complete series of Doctor Who where I just had no impulse whatsoever to rewatch any of it after it aired, and it was really interesting to jump right into Flux immediately after Revolution of the Daleks, because to me, and I think probably to a lot of other people, something that defined a lot of the reaction to Flux was the extremely long wait for it, and the way that COVID kind of came in and made it so there was no Doctor Who for over a year. So that fact built up a lot of pressure for Flux to perform, I think. And
taken without that pressure, there was so much of it that I came to appreciate, and that is the Chibnall Era as a whole. Taken divorced from pressure and divorced from the circumstances of its airing, there's a lot to appreciate here. There's a lot of problems, but there's so much that I'm glad that I did this rewatch for. And, I hope that if you made it this deep into the video, that I was able to help you maybe appreciate some of those things. But, yeah. Let me know your sort of holistic thoughts on this era in the comments. Like, share. If there's any particular things that I've said that you have thoughts on, voice that in the comments. Thank you for listening. Peace out.